Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
You know that moment when someone smiles at you, but you can feel the knife under it, the way the corners of a mouth curve up while the eyes measure what they can get away with without being called out, the way a sentence is dressed as interest, but carries the weight of a dare. Because that is what my family has done to me for years, long before the Easter brunch that blew everything open, long before my aunt leaned in with her practiced sweetness and asked me what I was doing with my life while she poured another round of approval for my cousin Jessica, and it sounds dramatic to say I felt the blade before it touched me, but that is the only honest way to describe the pattern, the repetition. The little digs that trained me to stand still and smile so they could compare me to their favorite, as if my only job was to be the backdrop that made her glow a little brighter. I learned early that their version of support came with conditions I could never meet, because no matter what I did there was always a reason it did not count. And when I landed a decent role after college, the comment from my aunt was that at least I had something to keep me busy until I figured out a real path. And when Jessica posted about a volunteer committee, my aunt responded with a paragraph about leadership and promise and legacy, which would have been fine if it had not come with a group text nudge to me asking whether I had considered taking a few online classes or trying a certification, because it might help me get my confidence up, and the worst part was not the words themselves. It was the tone. That syrupy kindness that makes you feel guilty for noticing the insult. After a while I stopped trying to correct the record, because every explanation invited a fresh interpretation that put me back in the category they already preferred, so I made a conscious decision to leave them in the dark and let the silence thicken. And when I started my company, I told exactly no one in the family, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to build without their commentary sticking to it like lint. And if you are wondering whether that was lonely, the honest answer is yes. It was lonely to work late and eat simple food and sign small clients who felt big to me while pretending at holidays that I was just figuring things out. But it was also peaceful, because every hour I put into the business only answered to me. And I came to value that more than any performance of acceptance from people who thought they already knew my ceiling. The favoritism around Jessica was not evil, it was just careless, the way people can be when they are so used to a story that they forget it might not be true anymore. And I would watch the way my aunt lined up praise like trophies while handing me the ribbon for participation, which I kept accepting because it was easier than fighting, until the day I realized I could choose a different game and keep the scoreboard to myself. So I built a service company with a few contractors who were better than I could afford at the time, and I paid them on time, and I learned to negotiate contracts without apologizing, and I kept my head down while the revenue grew from almost nothing to enough to pay my bills, and then enough to stack a cushion. And I stayed off social media and let my profile look quiet, because sometimes quiet is the mask you wear while you get strong. There were moments I almost cracked, like the evening my aunt called to say Jessica was thinking about leaving her job to launch something bold and entrepreneurial, and would I be willing to share any contacts from my brief time in marketing, because it might give her a lift. And I remember holding the phone and feeling that familiar tug to prove I was helpful, to be useful, to be the good sport, and I almost opened my notes and sent her a few names out of old reflex, but I stopped myself, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, because I had paid in time and risk and sleep for the network I was building, and I did not owe them free access just because their narrative had me parked in the back row, and I think that was the first small act of revenge. If you want to call it that, not a flashy move, just a quiet refusal to hand over the work of my hands to the same people who could not look at those hands without telling me to try harder. The funny thing is how fast people who underestimate you will assume they are entitled to your shortcuts, and when I declined kindly and said I did not have anything that would fit, my aunt gave me that loaded pause that means she heard a no and dressed it up as concern. And she said she hoped I was not closing doors for myself by being too private, which I took to mean she hoped I would keep playing the role of the helpful understudy. But that door stayed shut, and a week later a small agency passed me a contract that turned into a retainer, and I used that win to hire a part-time operations person who was faster than me and cleaner with process, and suddenly the business moved at a clip that hinted at something real, something that did not need to beg for permission at my own family table. I am not pretending I was a saint throughout all this, because there were nights I rehearsed imaginary speeches where I called out every slight, every time they praised Jessica for a minor thing while treating my real steps like errands. And there were mornings I woke up with that heavy feeling that you get when you know a conversation is coming that will press your buttons on purpose. But I kept reminding myself that my best reply would never be a speech. It would be outcomes they could not dismiss, agreements with signatures, cash flow that did not need approval, and the kind of leverage you only get when you own the lane instead of asking to merge into theirs. And with that clarity, I did something else that would not look like revenge to an outsider, but felt like a reset in my bones, which was canceling a professional favor my aunt wanted me to pull for a committee Jessica had joined. A little ask to convince a sponsor to renew, and I sent a polite note to the sponsor saying I could not recommend the event this year due to conflicts, which was true, because the conflict was my conscience. That little boundary did something inside me, because for the first time in years I did not swallow the discomfort to make them more comfortable, and a few weeks later, when the family started planning Easter brunch with the same choreography as always, I could feel a steadiness that made me dangerous in a way I had never been at that table, not because I wanted a fight, but because I did not fear one anymore, and as the invitations went out and the group thread lit up with praise for Jessica's supposed leap into entrepreneurship, I held a document on my laptop that would change the terms of every conversation, a document with signatures that mattered to her new idea more than she knew, and I kept my mouth shut and my schedule clear. Because sometimes the best preparation is patience. So when my aunt finally leaned over at that brunch with the question she always saves for me, the one that pretends to care while checking whether I still know my place, I already knew exactly what I would say, and I already knew what would happen to the room when I said it. And if you think I am exaggerating the silence that followed, just wait, because the line I chose was simple, the timing was precise, and the fallout was the point, and all of that began with one decision I made before I walked in the door, a decision I will tell you about next, because it was the first move in a plan that would make my aunt's smile crack right down the middle. If I am being fully honest, the choice to keep my mouth shut did not come from some enlightened strategy or a guru quote I stuck to my fridge. It came from fatigue. From the kind of tired you get when every update about your life is turned into a debate by people who are not actually debating facts so much as protecting an old picture where you are always a step behind. So I told myself I would stop feeding their storyline and start feeding the thing that could feed me back, which was this small, stubborn company that looked unimpressive on paper but made a kind of sense to me that did not require applause to keep going. And once that clicked, I treated family gatherings like an off-site with strict confidentiality where all sensitive topics were marked "Do Not Discuss." That meant I built my mornings around work that did not need permission, and I built my evenings around learning the parts one had been avoiding because they made me feel out of my depth. And when a potential client sent me a test project with terms that were barely worth the time, I stayed up until it was good enough to be undeniable, and then I delivered early with a tone so clean they asked if I could take a second round. And I said yes, but increased the rate without apologizing, and when they paid it without blinking, I felt a little switch flip in my head, because the story I had been swallowing at my family table about being the soft one or the distracted one was not lining up with the story money was telling me. And money may not be love, but it is honest, and that honesty helped me keep my promise to myself to stay quiet where quiet served me. There were small wins that felt private and precious, like the day I hired a contractor who ran circles around my manual spreadsheets and built a system that cut my waste in half. Or the afternoon a brand I had admired from a distance agreed to a monthly retainer that would cover my basic expenses even if nothing else closed for a while. And these were not things I wanted to parade, because I was not building a parade. I was building a business, which meant more checklists than champagne and more moments of swallowing panic than posting inspiration. Yet underneath all of that I kept hearing my aunt's voice pushing me to prove I was not lazy, and the less I tried to prove it, the more the work itself started proving it without me, which felt like justice beginning at home. You might think staying off social media was some anti-attention stance, but really it was risk management, because I knew that if my family caught wind of any progress, they would yank the conversation back to whether I was being too ambitious or too cautious or too whatever it took to put me back into the role of the one who needed their guidance. So I did the boring thing and let my feeds go quiet, and if anyone asked, I said I was taking a digital break, which was partially true, except my break was from being managed by other people's excitement cycles, and it is incredible how much clearer your work becomes when you stop performing it for people who are grading you on a rubric they made in high school. Somewhere in that stretch, right when I was feeling sturdier but still tender enough to wobble, my aunt started floating a new topic in the group thread about how Jessica had this brave idea brewing and how entrepreneurship was in her blood and how the family was so proud of her courage to bet on herself, and the words were fine on the surface. Yet baked into them was that old comparison cake they loved to serve, which is to say they were proud someone was doing the thing I had quietly been doing without applause, and I felt the heat rise in my cheeks even alone in my kitchen, but I did not type a thing, because I had already learned that clapping for myself in that thread would not land as strength, it would land as a plea, and I was done pleading. Then, because the universe has a funny way of unmasking people, I got a message from a colleague who had heard through a vendor that a new founder named Jessica was sniffing around for services in my lane and using some of my old marketing samples as references. And, while I could not prove anything, the description sounded like my cousin, and I sat with that for a long minute, because part of me wanted to brush it off as coincidence and part of me wanted to call and say cut it out, and instead I opened my contracts folder and reread an exclusivity clause I had been developing with a key supplier who mattered a lot in our niche, a supplier whose reliability made or broke timelines, and I realized that if I locked this down, any newcomer would have to go through me or pick a second-tier option that would slow them to a crawl, which would be painful for them and invisible to anyone outside, and the thought steadied my breathing in a way a speech never could. So I sharpened the clause with language an attorney friend had suggested over coffee, firm but fair, not predatory, just specific about volume commitments and response times and a small rebate if targets were exceeded. And I scheduled a call with the supplier and made the case that my growth curve justified a deeper partnership that would guarantee them consistent revenue while protecting me from being leapfrogged by loud newcomers, and I was ready for a pushback about my size. Except they surprised me by saying I had been easier to work with than bigger clients and that my forecasts hit close to reality, and by the end of the week we had a draft, the kind of draft that starts to feel like a hinge. Because if it swings your way, the whole door changes and the hallway behind it looks different. I did not tell a soul, not my parents, not my closest friend, not even the operations hire who had become my daily confidant. Because I wanted to walk into Easter brunch with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the ground under your feet is yours, not rented, and while they were sending around menu preferences and family jokes, I was reading terms and checking for holes. And on the morning we finalized the agreement, I felt a calm I had not felt in years, a wide quiet that did not ask for witnesses, and I took a screenshot of the signed page and saved it to a hidden folder with a name so boring no one would ever click it by accident. If you are waiting for me to say I softened and gave my aunt a hint, I did not, because the point was not to brag. The point was to stop giving them the power to narrate my work as a hobby. And when the brunch finally happened and she leaned in with that familiar staged concern and asked about my plans while bragging about Jessica's bold leap, I smiled and answered with the line I had practiced. And the table went quiet in that brittle way people go quiet when their usual script is interrupted. And while they were absorbing the idea that I might not be the understudy anymore, I opened my phone under the table and sent a short, polite email to the supplier confirming the press release language they could use about our partnership, which named my company as the exclusive provider in our category for a period that would make any fresh launch sweat, and as I hit send I knew I had just placed a piece on the board that Jessica would find blocking her favorite lane before she even put her car in drive, which is why when my aunt's face paled and she glanced toward the kitchen, I understood she already knew something was off, and I knew the next move I made would not be spoken out loud at that table. It would be delivered to the one person who needed to read it in black and white. When I tell you the table went quiet after I said my company was already running and doing better than they would ever guess, I am not exaggerating for effect. Because the hush that followed had that specific weight families get when a reliable punchline suddenly stops landing, the kind of pause where everyone waits for someone else to restore the order of things. And in that pause I kept my face calm and took a sip of water while my aunt's smile loosened around the edges and Jessica shifted in her chair like she had been called on in a meeting she did not prepare for. Yet even then I did not gloat, because gloating gives them a foothold to call you petty, and I wanted something cleaner than a victory lap. I wanted a change of terms. My aunt tried to recover with that brisk tone she uses when she wants to steer the conversation back to the approved agenda, saying how wonderful it was that both of us were thinking in an entrepreneurial direction, and how the world needs more women who build things, which would have sounded empowering if it had not been delivered like a patch slapped over a leak. And then came the part she could not help, the little qualifier where she said Jessica's idea was especially timely because she had been talking to a couple of very promising suppliers, and maybe I should talk to them too if I ever wanted to get serious, and I could feel the muscle in my jaw jump, not because I was rattled, but because she had no idea I had already signed the paper that made her sentence obsolete before it left her mouth. Jessica looked down at her phone the way people do when they want to leave their body without getting up, and I noticed the familiar screen brightness on her face and thought, fine, check whatever you need to check. Because while she scrolled, I opened my email under the table and found the draft with the exact language my supplier had approved for standardized responses to new inquiries from my category. Not mean, not dramatic. Simply a note that due to an existing exclusive agreement they could not onboard a new account in this product lane without my written approval, and would the inquirer like an introduction to my team to explore partnership options. And I stared at that sentence for a heartbeat because it represented years of swallowing my pride converted into one clean boundary I did not need to shout about. I just needed to set it in motion. I pressed send to confirm the template, and then I waited. And while I waited, my uncle made small talk about sports, and my mother asked if I had tried a new recipe, and my father gave me that quick glance he uses when he wants to know if he should defend me or stand down. And I signaled him to stand down by reaching for the bread and asking about something neutral, because I wanted this shift to register not as a fight, but as an update to reality, and right then Jessica's phone buzzed in that unmistakable way a business email buzzes, the short double tap of a new message that matters, and she watched the screen the way you watch a glass slip off a counter when you are too far away to catch it. And for a second I could see her trying to control her face and failing. She cleared her throat and said she would be stepping outside for a minute, which my aunt covered by saying something about taking a quick call, and I just nodded and asked my mother to pass the salad, keeping every line of my body relaxed because there is a difference between winning and letting them see you savor it, and I wanted the win to look like gravity, not fireworks, inevitable instead of loud. And a few minutes later my aunt followed her out with a napkin still in her hand, and the energy in the room shifted the way it does when the chief cheerleader leaves the bleachers. Suddenly everyone could hear themselves think, and that is when my father, of all people, leaned in and asked quietly, not teasing, not testing, just curious, whether I was really doing better than they would guess, and I said yes, I was, and that was the end of that conversation because for once the answer did not invite debate. When my aunt returned, her smile had been ironed flat, and she was back on message, except the message had lost its confidence, and she started asking me the kinds of questions people ask when they realize they might have been underestimating you for a long time. Like how long had I been at this, and what made me choose my niche, and whether I was hiring, and I gave her the truth in measured pieces without offering anything I did not want to be repeated, because I was not there to convert them into fans. I was there to put my work on the record without asking for permission, and even as I answered I could see Jessica reappear at the edge of the room, face set, shoulders tense. That brittle posture people get when they have just been told the runway they were counting on is closed for repairs, and she came back to the table and pushed food around her plate and said she was not very hungry, which no one commented on because they were busy reshelving their assumptions. I kept the conversation easy, and when it made sense, I let a small thing slip that sounded harmless, but landed like a memo, mentioning that this quarter looked stable and that I was finally delegating more, which to them translated as she is not flailing anymore, and to me translated as let us normalize my competence without asking me to perform gratitude. And when the plates were cleared, I excused myself to wash my hands, and in the hallway I sent one more email, this time not to the supplier, but to a neutral inbox I use for partnership outreach, addressed to Jessica at the address she uses for business, a simple, polite note that said I understood she might be exploring vendors in a category my company currently manages under an exclusive agreement, and if she wanted to move fast I could propose two options. Either a reseller arrangement with margins that would still leave her room to build her brand, or a white label structure where she could launch without disrupting timelines. Both professional, both efficient, both unmistakably framed as her going through me, and I kept it stripped of gloat because power is clearer without perfume. I hit send and stood there long enough to feel my hands stop shaking, not from fear, but from the release that comes when you turn a long ache into a single irreversible action. And then I walked back to the table and thanked my aunt for the food and asked who wanted coffee. And I watched Jessica look at her phone and choose not to open the email in front of me, and I took that as a sign that she understood exactly what the next months of her life would require if she wanted to proceed, which is to say she would need to either slow down or route through me, and either way the narrative that had always put me in the waiting room had just been retired without a speech, and the part that makes me smile even now is that no one at that table could call it cruel or petty. Because all I did was make official what they had refused to see, and even if they never admit it, they will remember this meal as the day their favorite story stopped being true, which is why when my phone buzzed a minute later with a reply from someone I had been waiting on for months, I did not pick it up right away, because I wanted to sit in the quiet and let them feel it too, the new gravity of me, and the next thing I did, which I will tell you in a moment, is what locked the door behind me so no one could push me back into the hallway again. The thing about a quiet table is that it can make you feel generous, like maybe you should throw them a rope so they can climb back to whatever comfort they had before you spoke, but I had spent too many years handing out rope and then watching them braid it into a leash. So I let the silence do its job and I went home with the kind of focus that shows up when you stop trying to be understood and start acting like the person who signs the checks, and the first order of business was simple. Which is to say, I opened my laptop and did the practical things you do when you plan to win without shouting, beginning with a quick pass through the vendor list. I knew Jessica had been sniffing around and drafting two emails that were not dramatic, but were very clear. The first reminding them of the exclusivity terms now in effect, and the second offering a reseller path for anyone Jessica sent, so they would not feel cornered and I would not feel like I had left a crack where someone could pry. I was not going to chase gossip about which supplier had told her what, because the fastest way to lose leverage is to turn it into a story about personalities. But I did allow myself one strategic eavesdrop when the cousin who plays both sides called me that evening with a pretend casual tone about how exciting it all was, and how he had heard Jessica might be courting a specific mid-size co-packer to handle her first run. And I said something bland like good for her while I typed the name into my notes and pulled up the calendar, because I already had a relationship with that co-packer through a smaller line I ran last year, and what I needed now was not a fight, it was capacity. And capacity is the part almost no one on the outside understands until they learn it the hard way, which is that if you do not have it when you need it, no pitch deck will save you. The next morning I called the co-packer and laid it out without drama, explaining that my growth curve had accelerated, that I was forecasting steady volume through the year, and that I was prepared to put down a non-refundable retainer to hold a block of weeks across the next 2 quarters with an option to extend into the holiday push, and because I had never once missed a payment or made their team babysit my timelines. The conversation moved quickly from if to how, and by lunchtime we had paper that guaranteed me the exact weeks Jessica would need to hit the launch date her mother had been trumpeting in the group thread with those little exclamation points that used to make me roll my eyes in the bathroom. And I sat there looking at the agreement with a level of petty satisfaction I will not deny, because sometimes the fair thing also feels good, and I am allowed to admit that. I know someone will ask if locking that capacity was cruel, and my answer is that it was decisive, because I did not lock it to starve her, I locked it to meet commitments I had already made. And if she wanted to enter the lane I dominated, she could absolutely do it. She would just need to either adjust her timeline or take the reseller offer I had already sent with generous margins, which is to say I did not slam the door. I put a handle on it, and then stood on my side and waited to see if she wanted to push or knock, And while I waited, I did something practical that felt almost silly in its simplicity, but mattered more than any speech, which was to set up ads on the search terms everyone in our niche bothers when they are first shopping around, including the phrase my aunt had been parading as Jessica's shiny new brand name, because brand names are not sacred until you defend them at scale, and I have spent enough time on the internet to know that the first thing most people do is type a phrase and click the top link without reading the fine print. So I wrote calm, boring copy that promised fast turnaround, clean compliance, and a live human on the phone within one business day, and I did not mention a competitor by name because I am not a clown. And I set the budget to a number that would make my accountant sigh but would make my point, and then I moved on to the part that would decide the whole season, which was the pilot client I had a history with. A mid-tier retailer who had to choose between launching a new category with a known entity or taking a chance on a fresh face, and I knew from experience that they cared less about sizzle than about being able to pick up the phone and get someone who would fix a problem without turning it into a saga. So I scheduled a meeting, not a pitch. And I went in with a one-page plan that crossed every T and closed every gap, including a performance guarantee that would trigger a small rebate if we missed a metric by more than a sliver, which I could afford because missing metrics was not my habit. The meeting was short, which is how you know you are dealing with professionals, and at the end the buyer said the sentence I had been waiting to hear since the day my aunt called me a dabbler, which was that they preferred boring reliability to brave experiments and that they would like to keep expanding with me rather than splitting their attention, and I shook his hand and drove home feeling a kind of calm I wish I could bottle, because once you have the pilot, the co-packer, and the supplier in agreement, what you have is a moat that does not need neon lights to be seen, and I kept that calm as I drafted one more email, this time to Jessica, referencing the note I had sent after brunch and attaching a simple two-option proposal with dates, margins, and a clear path to launch without delays if she partnered instead of pushing against the wall I had just made a little taller. Her reply came in the middle of dinner, a clipped thank you that made it obvious she was furious, but trying to sound like a boss, saying she would consider both options and get legal eyes on them, which told me two things. The first being that she had just learned how expensive momentum becomes when you do not own the choke points, and the second being that my aunt had not yet explained to her that business is not a family talent show where the loudest applause wins. And I did not answer right away, because the person who replies instantly is the person who is still trying to be liked, and I am too old and too busy for that. So I finished my meal and slept like a person who knows the locks are working. The next morning, I woke up to two emails that made me laugh into my coffee. The first from the co-packer forwarding a message they had received from Jessica's new operations lead asking for rush capacity in the exact weeks I had already secured. And the second from a vendor who told me, with the kind of amused neutrality only vendors can pull off, that my cousin's team had discovered the exclusivity with my supplier the hard way and were asking whether there was any wiggle room, and I wrote back with the same politeness I reserve for parking tickets, saying the terms were firm, but that I remained open to a reseller or white label path if the volume forecasts penciled out. And then I closed the laptop and went for a walk, because sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is let the other party sit in the truth without you hovering. By afternoon, my aunt was calling, and I let it go to voicemail because I wanted her to put her request into words without me smoothing it, and when I listened later, the message was a masterpiece of selective memory and emotional choreography, full of lines about family pulling together and how wonderful it would be if I could show some flexibility for Jessica's first quarter, because you only get one launch once, and I smiled because she had just admitted the part she would not say out loud at the table, which is that I was now the gate, and gates can swing open or stay shut, and the sweet part is that I did not need to be cruel to keep it shut. I just needed to keep my standards where they had always been when no one was watching. And as evening settled, I drafted a final note that did not threaten or gloat. It simply laid out the calendar, the thresholds, and the options, ending with a sentence that would sound generous to anyone who did not know the backstory and would sound like a verdict to anyone who did, and I scheduled it to send at 9 the next morning, because timing is a language too, and I wanted them awake, caffeinated, and unmistakably aware that the story they had told about me for years had been replaced by a contract. A schedule, and a choice, and the thing I did right after I set that send time is the part one have not told you yet, the one that made sure there would be no last-minute rescue from a surprising ally, because I decided to pull one more lever. Quiet and final, that would seal my position before the day even began. I said I had one more lever, and it was not revenge in the movie sense or some dramatic gotcha designed to make a crowd gasp. It was the kind of move you only learn to make after you stop trying to be liked and start learning the plumbing of how things really flow. Because once the supplier was exclusive and the co-packer weeks were mine and the pilot client had renewed into a broader rollout, I sat down with a legal pad and wrote out every remaining path Jessica could plausibly use to get to launch without touching me, and what I saw was small but real, a narrow alley that ran through a regional distributor with access to a secondary manufacturer and a third-party compliance lab that could, in theory, push her through if they stacked every piece perfectly and paid rush fees that would hurt but not kill, and I decided to brick that alley with the same calm I had used everywhere else, not to crush her, but to make it clear that if she wanted to move in my lane she would have to do it by my rules or do it somewhere else. So I called the regional distributor, not with threats or nostalgia, but with a simple package that said I was prepared to give them steady volume at fair margins if they would agree to a short exclusivity on my exact subcategory within their footprint. And if that sounded too tight, I offered a review clause after 2 quarters that would release them with no penalty if I failed to deliver, and they did what professionals do when a predictable partner offers them less drama and more revenue. They accepted the term sheet and gave me a confirmation email that looked ordinary to anyone not living inside our niche, which is to say it looked like business as usual, when really it was the last clean lock on the last clean door Jessica could have pushed. Then I did the unglamorous thing that rarely makes it into stories because it reads like paperwork. I called the compliance lab director and booked recurring testing windows for the next half year under a retainer structure my attorney had sketched out over coffee some months back, not a stranglehold. Just a capacity guarantee that would ensure my samples never got bumped and that any new client trying to rush through the same queue would be offered the leftover slots at a pace that would blow up a pre-announced launch, which meant that if Jessica tried to squeeze through this side door she would run straight into a calendar that said not this quarter, and when the director asked why I was locking so many windows I gave the answer that keeps doors open, which is that I would rather overpay for predictability than underpay for chaos, and we both laughed because that is a language operations people trust. With the plumbing handled, I turned to the part that would set the tone for what came next, because I did not want my win to read as petty or cagey or private for the sake of secrecy. I wanted it to read as leadership. So I drafted a short announcement for the local business journal, the kind that runs in a section most people skim, but the people who matter read closely. A clear note about our expanded partnership with the retailer and our investment in stronger regional supply chains, and I paired it with something I had planned months before but held until this exact week, a small grant program for women who were building boring companies that fix real problems, not glossy projects that exist to feed social feeds. And I named the grant after my grandmother, who did a lot of unpaid labor so the rest of us could sit at tables and argue about titles, and I put a simple application on my site that asked for receipts instead of pitches, because I have learned that receipts will tell you who is actually building. I timed the announcement for midweek morning when inboxes are quiet enough to let a headline breathe, and I sent an early copy to the buyer at the retailer with a thank you for believing in steady hands. And I sent another to the supplier with a note about the lab windows and the new distributor agreement, not to flex, but to reassure them that I was not going to burn their goodwill on a public victory lap, and when the piece ran it was not splashy. It was factual, which was exactly the point. And in the afternoon my mother called to say she had seen something online, and that she was proud of me, no qualifiers, no strange detours into advice, just pride, and I took the call standing up because I did not trust my voice to behave if I sat down. By the time my scheduled email to Jessica landed the next morning, the one with the clear calendar and the reseller and white label options and the non-negotiable dates, the pieces were already in place. And when her reply arrived that afternoon it was shorter than I expected and sharper too, a polite statement that they had decided to delay the launch to reassess supply strategy and that they would be in touch if partnership made sense. which in plain language meant that she had hit every wall. I had quietly sat and had done the math that said frustration is expensive, and I wrote back with the same professionalism I would extend to a stranger, saying I respected the decision and that my door remained open for a conversation that matched reality. And then I closed my laptop and let the room be still, because I had promised myself I would not chase a bow for this. The work was the bow. The real epilogue came a few weeks later at a small family birthday where no one had the energy for theatrics, and without a performance to anchor them, the conversations were softer and shorter. And when my aunt approached me with a careful smile, I felt my stomach tense and then release when she said she had read about the grant and that it was a good idea. And I said thank you and did not elaborate, because I am not a kid waiting for a sticker anymore. And she stood there for a beat like she wanted to ask for wiggle room on Jessica's behalf, and when she did not, I understood that she finally understood, not the numbers or the contracts, but the fact that I was not playing on their stage anymore. And that if they wanted access to what I had built, they would have to come through the door like everyone else, with clear asks, real terms, and a yes that was earned instead of assumed. If you are looking for a moral, you will not find one here, because I did not do this to teach anyone a lesson or to hold up a mirror and force them to apologize. I did it because I was tired of being defined by people who enjoyed the feeling of defining me. And because I wanted to know what would happen if I gave the same energy to my own plans that I had been spending on defending them. And what happened was simple. The business grew. The people who bet on me got paid on time. The partners who took a chance got steady volumes, and the family who liked me better in the waiting room learned that I do not sit in waiting rooms anymore unless I am the one calling the names, and that is not cruelty. That is adulthood with a spine. I am not pretending this solved every old bruise between us, or that I became some saint of boundaries, because I still have mornings where an old comment echoes and makes me want to drive across town and set the record straight in the pettiest way. But most days I pour that impulse into the work and let the outcomes carry the message, and if anyone asks whether I ever regretted not making a speech at that Easter brunch, I tell them the truth, which is that no clever line would have done what one contract, 2 calendars, and a handful of deliberate choices did. And if you are wondering whether I will ever open the lane for Jessica, the answer is that my door is not locked from the inside. It just has a handle that requires respect. And if she wants to knock with a plan that makes sense for both of us, I will hear it. Until then, the quiet is enough, the work is enough, and the look on my aunt's face when she realized I had changed the terms without raising my voice will be more than enough for a very long time, because I did not just win, I changed the game I was being judged in, and once you do that, you do not go back.